Good afternoon, and welcome. If you can grab your seats. Okay, if you can just grab your last few people, scoot in. You are all very welcome. I hope you had vibrant and quite interesting World Café sessions. There were 6, you got 2 of them. Thanks, great. What we've got now is someone called Gordon Alexander, who is on Young Lives International Advisory Board, and for that we love him. He also is director of UNICEF's research office in Florence, the Innocenti group that many of us use their products of very, very frequently. He's currently a consultant on social and economic policy and planning and strategy, but today, Gordon is actually a superhero. He's doing what none of us could do with, I'm sure, the ability that he's going to do it, and he somehow used his superpowers to catch just a few points from around the different World Café sessions. He's not claiming to cover the sort of tip of the iceberg even on all 6 of the sessions, but he's going to be able to give us a little window into some of the high points of the 6 sessions that were going on this afternoon, of which we only got to attend 2. So for that, I'm very grateful to introduce Gordon.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm about to do sort of one of those things that you have to do sometimes in meetings, which is to improvise. Because each of your sessions has been brilliant, and you've been so rich discussions. And each of the sessions is actually going to be captured by your rapporteurs. And we asked each of the rapporteurs to not only to capture the main takeaways, but to come up with the one big takeaway from their group. So in trying to give you that feedback, it's going to be very, very abstract or synthesized, but I think we'll try to just see what it looks like together. And then maybe we might make some comments. But I've also been asked to make the transition for the panel that we'll be having in the late afternoon on child poverty. And so I'll also do that. So I have also an incredibly strict timeline in terms of doing all this. So that's the mission impossible. But with the slide, could I just take the second slide? Is anyone able to move the slide along? Okay, so this is actually the feedback. So what you have to do is you have to imagine each of these blocks, which would be saying incredibly important things to you. And I think that's the end of my session. But in the meantime, I'm going to try and do a very bad job of summarizing what each of the groups have said back to me, because, and I'm going to just wing it, as you also have to do. So the education group first, we tried to sort of say, what is new? What is something happening inside these areas? And what's the big action? And who should be doing it? That's the sort of kind of format which we have. And so the education group, which I think was really interesting in terms of their debate, because I sat in on it and I got a little bit lost in that discussion and I found it very interesting. I think they zeroed in on a number of issues, but the one that came up particularly was that the importance of schooling as a scalable platform for, sorry, maybe that will be, oops, is that on my things? No, sorry, that the real need is the need for attention to equity. and that is where the research effort and policy effort is to come in. And it's to move away, perhaps, from measuring inequality. So it's the attention to equity, and it is to avoid some of the kind of perhaps dead ends of measuring, and how indicators can actually backfire and be the wrong incentives. And in terms of action, they suggested that we need to reconceptualize basic skill indicators to support research and policy. So that's the education feedback. So for child protection, I think the discussions there, I think, had followed on from the panel more in the morning. And what they're asking here is that greater emphasis on the intersections of structural and interpersonal violence in children's lives. And that's to try and for that, there is a need for a minimum set of services and trained personnel for child protection. So the idea of kind of focusing in on that intersection of underlying factors which are causing it, but also to have appropriate personnel there. And so our sort of child protection group came up with a very succinct one there. In nutrition, which was again the whole, in a way, was also a major shift. We're talking, which again picked up from this discussion this morning, and their main takeaway was that we need to have a change in our language from stunting to healthy growth. And I think that in that sense, that would provide the kind of re-incentive to programming away from one concept that maybe has achieved a lot, but maybe has had its limitations. And that should be over the life course. So the nutrition group emphasized this shift away from the current paradigm. The third one, the social protection group, I'm afraid I sort of, that one we haven't got them yet. We have? Okay. Would you want to perhaps give them then, Paul? Quick, just maybe read them. Sorry.
Sorry, we missed you on the queue. I guess in terms of the main takeaway, I'm super summarising the group. I guess one of the main takeaways is that social protection for children is absolutely essential, but it won't do everything. It sits alongside a range of other bits of provision, and most of the discussion that we have is around governance, political economy, systems, and that's really the action, I suppose, is to understand more about what drives sustainable systems and how social protection sits in and alongside other things.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so again, systems there. The labour market group, their focus was on the aspirations, and that they change over time, and that they are gendered and they are influenced by marginalisation. But in some ways, we've got to move the social norms of the community in direction of more appropriate aspirations. And there was a subsidiary goal, they squeezed it in, the move towards 21st century skills, but warning that this could be a two-edged sword, that while the whole area of digital skills and interesting areas of teamwork, it couldn't create a new divide between those who have and those who haven't. So a labour market attention. And then lastly, in adolescence which is the one I started with, was the whole idea of schools being the entry point for as a scalable platform to engage with the adolescents. Because I think we're missing that real point of contact with this age group. It falls between the cracks, or it's lost in the existing systems. And for that, it's that we still, while we're engaging in adolescence, we have to be aware of the gender side, of the risks for girls in particular, and the disadvantaged. So that was the adolescent side, and it was the action point was on addressing gender norms in support of it, and the importance of girls' voice and empowerment. So that was sort of a summary list, and I was asked to sort of, okay, so what, it was meant to be up there, and you were supposed to be thinking about it as a group of activities, or of takeaways. I think one thing that strikes me is in each of these areas there is a thread of conceptualization and the need for moving that and how to move it so that it transforms programs and policies. So there's something about a shift needed. And there is this thread of gender and marginalization and systems that we've got coming out of it. But to me, the question that I get, which is, as I look at it, is we look at 6 areas here, is immediately, yes, okay, 6 areas, but what does that mean then for integration? What does it mean for linkages? So I think the big question coming out of here would be, well, yes, each of those has contribution, but for children, we're going to need other platforms for bringing all this together. So I thought that was sort of one. But would anybody else quickly, as they've heard it, like to offer a quick sort of introduction, on another observation on what we've seen? Yes, Andy.
I'm worried about schools and the gender and adolescence as the only channel. A lot of kids are not in school, and there are other institutions in society that would be useful to add to that list. Faith-based communities would go.
Yes. Great, okay. Susan, yes.
I'm a bit concerned about the SDGs in a way, because they are kind of sectionalising things again, for purposes of reporting when we're talking about integration. And my big thing is how do you measure sort of in terms of integrated approaches.
Okay, so, yeah, okay. Any other quick sort of last things? Yes, Olivia.
Gender comes under adolescence, but not under the others.
That's right.
The life cycle aspect of each one of these, and children of different ages, is, I think, crucial.
Yes, I think that was the theme of the morning sessions too, wasn't it? It's just we've got to think about things much more in a life course things. Maybe not even just stopping at early parenting, but also thinking about the consequences also of old age. I mean, if parents are migrating, then grandparents become critical carers in the home, and also so as a point there. Okay, so why I wanted though to, while we've just thought about the group work, I also wanted, though, to make a couple of comments on what I've seen, though, in the analysis that has been done by Young Lives, because I think that's in the work that you've got there. There's something new happening, and I would pick out just 2 things. One is that if you look at it, you can see in the Young Lives analysis they are analysing by lower and higher deciles performance. What's happening to children between these two deciles. So that, I think, is opening the whole issue of inequalities and tracking them. So I think the Young Lives points to the Young Lives data in terms of opening up the debate in the SDGs on inequalities. And secondly, if I say, it'll be the whole issue of the country comparisons. We have the analysis of returning of the 4 countries. And I think that that's such an important part in terms of the contribution of the Young Lives analysis, because it is that comparative analysis between the 4 countries, all of which were going through economic growth. That's also the lessons to be learned from the countries. So I think the Young Lives analysis providing that is, I think, is increasingly going to be one of the contributions they're making to the SDGs. So I understand the Minister is with us, so I'm going to step down from things, and we'll sort of reorganize our times. But thank you very much for the rapporteurs who did a great job, and they are not responsible for this presentation. They'll be sharing their things, but that's how you do things, on the fly. So thank you very much.
So it's my honour and my pleasure. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Harriett Baldwin, who is the Minister of State for Africa at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also Minister of State at DFID. Would you like to take the floor? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I guess that if you're used to working in Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam, this climate feels right at home. But for me, I have to confess, I'm feeling a little bit the worse for the heat. But it's really wonderful to be able to come here and celebrate with you the amazing work of this 15-year longitudinal study for young lives. And clearly it builds on the tradition and leadership that the UK has in this kind of research. I know this because my very own dear late lamented mother was one of these subjects in one of these post-war studies, and so every once in a while she had to go along and have her health looked at. So I know that there is a rich tradition of expertise in the UK. I know not all of you are necessarily associated with UK universities, but nevertheless, this study builds on some of that traditional richness of research. And as you know, we're passionate about the work that we're doing in terms of global education and 12 years of quality education. It is something that all of us as ministers, from the Prime Minister downwards, really, really believe in. It is crucial that the funding and the work that we put into it is based on the kind of solid foundations of research that this particular study has delivered. And I am particularly pleased to see that in terms of something that I think has become more widely recognised, more widely known in recent years, this importance of nutrition in the very early years and those the very early months of life. That has been very much borne out by the rigorous way in which you have approached this study, and with a particular focus on cognitive development in it, and ensuring that children are properly fed in their very first years is obviously a crucial part of the interventions that we are able to fund through the Department for International Development. And the numbers are really quite striking. 33 different countries where we have funded nutrition programs. And so far, by the end of 2017, we'd already helped 26.3 million children under 5. And adolescent girls and women of childbearing age with the relevant nutritional interventions. And we have the funding in place to continue with those interventions to reach another 50 million people by 2020. And of course, with the 0.7% of GNI enshrined in statute in this country, I certainly will always be championing the importance of that early nutritional work in terms of the work that we do with our aid budget. And I was also fascinated to learn about the work that has come through in terms of helping with some of the cultural shift that, you know, I think, to be honest, we have to live through, certainly in my lifetime as someone who grew up in a world where people did invest a lot more in the education of boys than the education of girls. You know, entering Oxford at a time when there were only 5 all-women colleges and a few mixed colleges, you know, in my lifetime. So it's wonderful to see how the cultural work that has come out of this, some of the examples of working with the mother of a 12-year-old girl who really was able then to articulate why she wanted her daughter to complete education and find a good job afterwards, you know, that has come out loud and clear in terms of this, this study. And I think the world has made a lot of progress in terms of the numbers of people attending, particularly primary school. But as this research has borne out, and it's wonderful to be able to draw on this kind of level of thoroughness, there is a particular importance that we need to attach to quality, which is why our slogan is always 12 years of quality education. And I was particularly excited to hear that some of the results in the study are particularly interesting in terms of the differences between countries, and that there's some compelling examples coming out of Vietnam in particular about some of that schooling adding much more value, especially for poor children in Vietnam than in other countries. So that's obviously fascinating and something that can be used to inform the work that is going on across the world in this. And then an important piece of work has come out of this in terms of adolescence, and we've always said that part of the value of extending education is that girls will choose to get married later and they'll choose to have children later, and that seems to be very much borne out by this study. And so thanks to the evidence that you've come up with, we can inform our work with that. And we also have observed that very much that the punitive approaches don't work in terms of tackling child marriage, that as with so many examples of things we politicians like to do in terms of passing laws, very often they can be counterproductive and move practices underground. There's no difference here, and therefore the programs that have been informed by this work to create the cultural change has been also very valuable. So some remarkable pieces of evidence coming out of the Young Lives programme. It is also fascinating to hear about the evidence that's been gathered about the ways in which stunting can be addressed by later in life nutritional interventions as well. And again, that's very, very helpful and very, very informative. And then one of the barriers that does frequently get cited, and in fact more and more is coming up in terms of discussion around keeping girls in school, is the issue around puberty and menstruation, and what a barrier that can be to remaining in secondary school. So it's very helpful that this has provided such compelling evidence for that, because that can then inform some of the programs that we obviously already do fund programs in this area, but fund programs that come from some of the additional funding that we've announced. So I think in terms of our commitment to keeping girls in school for those 12 years of quality education, the important work that's come out of this study that will help inform our work in ending violence against women and girls, really, really fascinating study. And so I'm very, very pleased to be here on behalf of the department to thank you. We've been committed to this study since 1999 and clearly has given us a richness and wealth of evidence that will be drawn on for many years to come. And so I'd like to congratulate you all. I'd like to thank Joe and the team in Oxford and the research teams in Ethiopia, India, Peru and Vietnam for all of their inspirational and tireless effort on this programme. And then perhaps above all, thank all of those children who have opened up their lives to us throughout the course of this study and from whom we have learnt so much. So thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you. And now I'm hoping that I will be able to introduce Shiv Kumar to give the keynote speech. Shiv, where are you hiding? You're over there. I just had that sudden horrible feeling. Oh no, he's not in the room. But Shiv is going to share with us his keynote speech, and obviously has made an incredibly important contribution in this very, very valuable area of work. So thank you very, very much.
My role today, but I also, had a special pleasure in introducing Shiv Kumar, because Shiv and I worked together in India in the 1990s, and he's been an extraordinary figure of research around children since then. As many of you know him as the current co-chair of the project of the No Violence in Children, but you also know that in those early days he was a collaborator with Amartya Sen and Mahbub-ul Haq on the ideas of human development. Now we tend to take that as a granted, but at that time it was really innovative and far-reaching in the shifts that's there. So Shiv was part of that. He likes to call himself an unconventional economist, and I think that we're going to hear some unconventional presentation. I hope it is. But I think his other great skill is that his passion has been education in India, where he's been involved in the struggle for the right of education and the battle of child labor that was associated with it. But essentially he's a political economist. He's not an economist of numbers. He's a person of insight. And he is always... Sorry, I should have said that. I keep my accent. But I think what he has got is a remarkable ability to look at the big picture. And I think so. Shiv, it's wonderful to have you here, and a special pleasure to welcome you to the... Thank
you. Good evening, and as you can see, I'm under great pressure now to show how insightful I can be, unlike others the whole day. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this day-long conference. I shall be returning to India with my head buzzing with new ideas to develop and more research to pursue. Today, I would like to address three broad questions relating to social science research and childhood poverty. One, how well has social science research contributed to our understanding of the enhancement of children's capabilities and the ending of childhood poverty? Two, why is research more important today than it has been in the past? And three, how can we ensure that social science research stays relevant in the post-truth era, as it's now come to be called? Let me begin by reflecting on the contribution of social science research to our understanding of children's well-being. I notice an unfortunate reluctance to support research on childhood poverty, even by many agencies of the United Nations and bilateral agencies that have traditionally done so. Thank you. Why has the grumbling against social science research been growing? There are at least two commonly cited reasons. First, policymakers and program administrators seem to be in a hurry. They are impatient. They need instant solutions. They say they cannot wait for 5 or 10 years for the results of research to inform policy and practice. And in any case, by the time the results of research are out, the world has changed, so rapidly changing. They question the usefulness of research for the future when the focus of research is on the past. Second, most public administrators and now increasingly funders believe that there's really no need for any further thinking on the what and why of the problems. Everyone knows what to do, what works, what doesn't. Therefore, the focus has to be on implementation, and that is the need of the hour. Let me begin by saying that both these charges against social science research are not fair, neither are they true. Why do I say that? There are a number of reasons. I still recall an old UNICEF posters in the 1980s that posed a question on top of a child's smiling photograph, and the question asked, what would you like to be when you grow up? Talk about aspirations. And the answer at the bottom was, in capitals, alive. The primary focus of enhancing children's capabilities then was on first-generation problems, and child survival was a priority. And the world figured out a number of techno-managerial solutions, such as immunization and extending the reach of ORS to reduce child mortality. Today, we have moved well beyond child survival and are beginning to pay attention to thriving and the flourishing of children's lives. And research has been contributing, I would argue, in significant ways to understanding of second-generation problems of childhood. For example, it has been pointed out several times that only recent research has thrown up the importance of investing in the first 1,000 days or in early childhood development. To give another example of the useful contribution of research, a solid body of new research has established that acting early is the key to preventing mental health problems. In a recent paper, Professor Vikram Patel of Harvard University, for instance, identifies 3 sets of epidemiological observations that underlie the opportunity to reimagine the prevention of mental health problems. The first is that regardless of the clinical phenotype of the mental health problem, childhood neglect and deprivation, which takes a range of forms from adverse family circumstances and the effects of poverty to exposure to abuse and violence, is a very strong risk factor. The second observation is that the majority of mental health problems encountered in adulthood have their origins before the age of 24 years. The third observation, which neatly triangulates with these findings, is acting early in the life course from birth, and some would argue from the fetal stage, through to young adulthood to modify social environments is likely to be the most promising investment to prevent mental health problems and realize many other goals, including better educational outcomes, better physical health, lesser social dysfunctions in the population. So such insights and research can go a long way in shaping policies, strategies, and programs. To take this, one of the lessons from this is that operations research from the field is increasingly pointing to the need for integrated and comprehensive approaches. To take Professor Patel's arguments further, he says, if you look at the field of early childhood development, early child development practitioners tend to focus on cognitive development in the first few years of life. He says child mental health practitioners tend to focus on emotional and behavioral problems in children and adolescents, and adolescent health practitioners focus on social determinants and risk behaviors in adolescence. Yet the evidence emphatically shows that the phenotypes, both those describing diverse mental health conditions and those reflecting a range of risk behaviors, share similar determinants, and that it is the cumulative experiences of adversity and protection across the early life course which provides the best prediction of adult well-being. Similarly, if we are to end violence against children, we need to look at all forms of violence across all settings simultaneously. This is because it is now evident that violence occurs across an interconnected spectrum, and working in silos quite doesn't help. So when it comes to children getting impacted by violence, what happens at home spills over into what happens in schools, and what happens in the community influences what happens at home. So in practice, the translation of this evidence calls for convergence at the level of every platform of the response to young people's well-being. I can go on giving more and more examples of the value addition of research. Let me give one more example and stop. Increasing evidence is linking violence in childhood with violence against women, partly because many young mothers are themselves children under 18, and partly because violence against children is often bound up with attacks on their mothers. Also, violence in the home against children and women is shaped by similar risk factors and is likely to occur in the same families, and the consequences are also often common and compounding. Therefore, research is pointing to the need to end violence against women as a necessary condition for ending violence against children. Lastly, I don't agree with the charge that we know everything. We have the evidence. What we need is to improve the efficiency of implementation. Nothing could be farther from the truth, especially when we look at second-generation issues of children's well-being. To illustrate, one of the major findings of No Violence in Childhood, the global learning initiative that I have co-chaired for the past 4 years, is that we need to know much more about what to do to prevent violence against children. As a matter of fact, almost 95% of the so-called evidence found in refereed publications and journals relates to only 12% of the world's population, mostly resident in North America and Europe. There is very little research and evidence from developing countries on how best to prevent childhood violence. In other words, a lot is happening in the field, very little is documented and analyzed, much less is known about what triggers violent behavior in different contexts and cultures and how to prevent it. Just to pick up another thought this morning, only 42 countries, as was mentioned, have data on physical violence and 40 on sexual violence against adolescent girls. When it comes to boys, data on physical violence against boys is only available for 6 countries, and on sexual violence in only 4 countries. Similarly, we know very little about violence and discrimination faced by children on account of disability, appearance, sexual orientation, HIV status, racial, ethnic, or religious identity. We also know very little about children who are trafficked or are forced to migrate because of war and conflict. Clearly, more research is needed to find out both the scale as well as the different dimensions of violence against children. Let me move to the second set of comments on why is research more important now than it was before. First, we face a real challenge in the development sector today because what you see is not what you get. This is especially true of the developing countries, where I find there's an increasing congruence in the space of commodities, but a disturbing divergence in the space of opportunities and capabilities. Even the poor in urban India, for instance, have access to television today, mobile phones, social media, and the internet. Young men in the slums dress the same way as any other young person would do, in blue jeans and t-shirts. Young women in slums are beginning to use the same cosmetics as the others, notably film stars, who are used to advertise shampoos and all kinds of beauty products by these corporations that are selling shampoos in sachets, affordable sachets, so as to reach the bottom of the pyramid. This has created a false sense of economic equality, when in reality there's a persistence and entrenchment of social inequality. It's, however, important to bear in mind that the improvement in standards of living may reflect physical transformation and even economic transformation, but growing opulence need not be accompanied by social transformation. To give you an example, according to the National Family Health Survey conducted in India in 2006, 54%, by the way, it's a higher proportion of women than men, 54% of women agreed that a husband is justified in beating his wife for one reason or the other. 10 years later, when the same survey was conducted and India's per capita income had more than doubled, we find that in 2016, 52%, down from 54%, 52% of women continued to believe that a husband is justified in beating his wife. Clearly, becoming richer does not mean that social norms and values will change for the better. Why isn't this happening? Research can offer good reasons that go beyond simplistic son preference and anti-female explanations to a more sophisticated analysis of gender, discrimination, patriarchy, and the denial of freedoms. A second reason why research is important today is because we live in a so-called post-truth era, where facts are distorted and lies are fabricated. Experts are branded as intellectuals and therefore irrelevant. By appealing to the emotions and repeating assertions several times, ground realities get buried and lost in public discussions. Some of you might know that in the field of development evaluation, where I work, this is referred to as the replacement of evidence-based policy making by policy-based evidence making. That's why we need more and better research to keep us on the right track and not get derailed by half-truths and untruths. There's a third reason why, therefore, we need good research. In the coming years, we're likely to be bombarded with statistics that show the absence of inequality, the reduction of discrimination, and the end of poverty. We will need good research to examine the validity of such claims. This is a good moment to recall what Carl Sagan said: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is quite possible that traditional indicators, which we saw this morning too, of childhood deprivation and poverty may not effectively pick up nuances of inequality and discrimination. For instance, that an equal proportion of boys and girls attend schools today may not reveal really what happens inside the classroom, namely the differential and preferential treatment of boys over girls. So there is another reason why we need solid social science research. We will need to look carefully at what lies behind the numbers and what the truth is behind the numbers. To do this, in the true spirit of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, researchers will need to think of different ways of generating evidence, new indicators, new measures, and innovative ways of capturing data that throw light on the freedoms that people enjoy and the flourishing of young lives. A fourth reason is that only research can help understand causality and getting to the roots of the problem. In this connection, I would like to flag two developments that have become, if not are becoming, super fads. The first is the growing popularity of randomized controlled trials, despite how expensive they are. It would be a big mistake, in my view, to put all our eggs in the RCT basket. And I think this was it was a suggestion that came up during the discussions as well. RCTs may be the best available method for correcting sampling biases and improving quantitative analysis. But RCTs do not correct for many other serious biases, including respondent bias, investigator bias, and more importantly, funding agency biases, which may all be distorting the truth. So we definitely need to look beyond RCTs and certainly not undermine the importance of qualitative methods and mixed methods. The second is the increasing emphasis on the use of big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. We should not forget that machine learning, at the end of it, is a ramped up version of correlation. And we all know that correlation isn't causation. Machine learning can be used to make prediction, but prediction is not solution. In public policy and social science, we need to think about causality. Machine learning is not a substitute for causal reflection. And that is why research is so important. So to just wrap up my comments on this section, machine learning can yield useful results, but it cannot become a substitute for genuine, solid, good research. Let me move to the last segment of my presentation and make some concluding comments on research priorities and related issues. I'd like to make 5 brief points. First, in order to ensure that social science research stays relevant in the post-truth era, it will be necessary to actively promote the democratization of research and evaluation by involving people at all levels and connect with people and communicate with them. In the field of in the physical sciences, there is often a single reality. But when you come into the social sciences, where people are the focus, there are multiple realities. And I think good research and good researchers will have to contribute to the social construction of truth by actively and proactively promoting governance by discussion as a way of finding solutions to complex social problems. Second, we should stop looking for piecemeal solutions and techno-managerial solutions. We must strike at the social and structural roots of many problems. When it comes to ending deprivations, individual efforts are important at reducing, say, childhood poverty, including investments in behavior change and communications. But we will not get the optimal results until and unless we tackle the structural determinants of poverty and discrimination. Third, it's important to focus for research to focus on the shrinking role of the welfare state. And I say this because I find in India and many developing countries that the state seems to have given up an important role of providing public goods. For instance, the state has failed to provide clean drinking water. So as citizens, we have found private solutions. We buy bottled water or get water filters put in our homes. The state has not been able to contain levels of pollution in New Delhi, one of the most polluted cities in the world today. So as citizens who can afford, as residents of Delhi who can afford it, we have found private solutions to the public goods problems. We buy face masks, or we have put air purifiers in our houses. So is it with schooling. Since government schools are not good, we in India are increasingly opting for private schools, and that's what the results of the Young India study also shows you. And these private schools continue to sprout with no quality control and no regulations. What is the vision of the welfare state in India? Can we afford to let the welfare state not provide even basic education to children? Research is needed to understand what is accounting for state failures. Fourth, this brings me to a related issue. If the state is failing to fulfill its responsibilities, can society rely on the profit-motivated private sector to safeguard the interests of children? Unfortunately not, I would argue. The fast food and junk food industry doesn't seem to care about the nutritional fallouts on children. It is sad that even in the United Kingdom, I believe you're setting a goal of reducing obesity by half by 2030. The advertising industry doesn't think twice about enticing children through cartoon characters to persuade their parents to buy all kinds of foods. The toy and gaming industry doesn't bother about the ill effects of introducing children at a very early age to crime, bloodshed, murder, and violence. This is not to deny the potential of the private sector, but to point out that policy formulation and regulation of the private sector needs to be backed by solid research and analysis of what really makes a difference. Finally, as an economist, there you go, got it. I want to point out that we need much better economic analysis to inform policies that address issues of childhood deprivation. For example, in the UK, as I was flying in, I find that UK criminals are exploiting the young. The article said that the possession of lethal weapons by young people is getting normalized. Obviously, research alone can unpack the sad story of the interconnections between trauma and dysfunction at home with truancy, deprivation, poverty, and the denial of opportunities. As in the economic sphere, we need to examine the costs of inaction and make a stronger case for increased investments in enhancing the capabilities of children. We need a better handle on costs and cost effectiveness, given that resources are scarce. More effort should go into gathering and reporting data on even budgets so we can track public spending on and for children. So let me conclude by saying that in the ultimate analysis, I might be an economist looking for cost-benefit analysis and cost effectiveness, but we should not forget that regardless of economic costs and benefits, there is a moral obligation that we have to protect and promote the rights of children. We definitely, in today's world, when there is a need to rethink the role of the welfare state and question the commitment of the private sector to act in the best interests of children, solid research is needed to set the agenda for a new discourse that looks more centrally at issues of childhood security and children's dignity in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Shiv, for a rich and I think equal parts congratulatory, encouraging, but also challenging talk. We much appreciate it, and I think you might have noticed that we showed our appreciation by giving you double time because it was top quality stuff, so it was great. Because we do need to keep to time, I'm going to ask that you hold the rich questions and comments that I'm sure you do have for Shiv until drinks after, when the day ends at 5:30. I'm going to hand over now to the Child Poverty Panel, which is chaired by Helen Pearson. And Helen is not a Young Lives insider necessarily, but she is a longitudinal study insider, even though more so perhaps than the Young Lives crowd. In Young Lives, we've been at it for 15 years, but Helen spent a good amount of time researching a book on a 70-year longitudinal study that she might say a few words about later. She published that research in a book called The Life Project, which was lauded by The Observer, the British Medical Association, and The Economist as one of their top books of the year recently. And I know many of you are fans of that book here in the audience. Helen will introduce the rest of the panel, and over to you.
Can I just ask my panel members to come up? That would be great. Thanks so much. So thanks very much for holding out till this last session. Thanks very much for asking me to come and talk here. It's really a pleasure to be here with these distinguished panelists and talk about this really important topic. So as Sam said, I am not an expert in child poverty, although I did encounter it recently in my work. I'm chief magazine editor for Nature, which is the international science journal, and my expertise is really as a science journalist, an author and an editor, and also just around evidence, of course, because almost everything we write about and publish at Nature is predicated on our belief that science and data matter and that the best solutions to societal problems are based on evidence. So I'm just going to say a very few words about how I became interested in this topic, and then I'll introduce the speakers. So I sort of inadvertently became fascinated by the topic of this session, child poverty, and also by longitudinal studies of children, because I wrote this book, as Sam mentioned, about the British birth cohorts. They are a series, a remarkable series of birth cohort studies, which have been tracking over 70,000 people altogether over 5 generations, starting in 1946, which I gather that Harriett's mother might be part of, based on what she said. And going on until the turn of the millennium. And obviously there are many parallels between the British birth cohorts and the Young Lives study, which is tracking thousands of children in countries around the world. And my original background is in biology and genetics, and I thought maybe I would be writing a book about that when I decided to write about these studies. But I actually sort of accidentally ended up writing about the lasting impacts of poverty and disadvantage, because really that's the biggest message that has emerged from those British birth cohort studies, that perhaps unsurprisingly now, children who were born into disadvantage and poverty have tended to follow a more difficult life trajectory. They do worse at school, they end up with worse jobs, they earn less money, and children who had a difficult start in life are also more likely to be in poorer health as adults. They have higher blood pressure, they're more likely to be overweight. And now, as they get older, some of these people are in their 70s, they are more likely to have a failing memory, to have poor health, and even to die earlier. And, you know, none of these messages are perhaps surprising, but we have to remind ourselves that it's only because of very long-running studies like this that we know that now. And it all supports, of course, this idea that our early circumstances have a profound effect on the way that our lives play out. And of course, the Young Lives study mirrors that. We know that since the turn of the millennium, children's circumstances have improved enormously in the countries where Young Lives is following children. But we also know that even if things have improved in real terms, that the poorest children are more likely to experience the worst outcomes. And as we've heard, in some contexts, the social and economic disparities are becoming more entrenched rather than less. So the real question to me is working out why, you know, trying to unpick the real causes, and of course working out the most effective ways to intervene to improve outcomes. And those are just incredibly complex questions, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that today. So this panel is going to look at the big issues around child poverty, and specifically how can the research, policy and advocacy worlds come together to help break these cycles of poverty and inequality and improve lives across generations. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk for about 10 minutes. There's going to be a sign going up if you go over that. And then we're going to open it out for questions at the end. So please think of your questions, have them ready to ask. So enough from me, I'll introduce the panel. So we have Joe Boyden, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. Joe is an anthropologist and director of Young Lives and a professor in the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. We have Rachel Glennerster. Rachel's chief economist at the Department for International Development. Previously, she was the executive director of JPAL and the lead academic for Sierra Leone at the International Growth Centre, which is a research centre based jointly at LSE and at the University of Oxford. And we have Richard Morgan. Richard is the global director of the child poverty theme for Save the Children. He's the co-founder and co-leader of the Global Coalition to End Child Poverty. And I think we are going to start with Richard, and then go to Rachel, and then go to Joe. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. Well, I'm happy to say to my fellow panelists that I don't have much to say. So the topic is too big for me to feel that I have much to say about it. I was working for a child rights organization, I actually have worked for a child rights organization since 1986, having misspent happily 7 years previous to that, working as an economist in the Ministry of Finance in Africa. And one of the child rights organizations I work for, an incoming country director, asked me, why are we doing child poverty? You know, the assumption being that doing poverty, attempting to reduce poverty, it will be sufficient for children. Sort of application of Reaganite trickle-down economics to the household level, no? Trickle down within households. Unfortunately, for that point of view, the evidence seems pretty clear that you can't rely on trickle down within households, even where average incomes are picking up, where MDG 1 was measuring the head count, it was measuring household poverty, it wasn't measuring child poverty, and the indicators were all over the place. Nutritional outcomes were stuck to a large extent across most of the developing world, whereas child mortality rates were falling rapidly and at historic levels. I think part of the problem, and in fact where I tend to locate the central problem for child poverty as childhood across the board, is in the relative or absolute invisibility of children in public policy making. This has been remedied in the last 23 or 4 years by the onset of the human species beginning to try to measure what's happening to its children, to collect data, in other words. This really began in the 90s with the DHS and the mixed surveys, more efforts to disaggregate by age in data. But let's, on the one hand, recognize how far we've come in those couple of 2.5 decades compared to childhood was tabula rasa up until the mid-90s, quite frankly. There were no data. In the African country where I worked in the civil service, it was the only country in sub-Saharan Africa to have a nutritional surveillance system of any kind at that time. It's just, astonishing compared with where we are now. So I am happy that we've come all that way in my little lifetime, but that I continue to detect a very strong tendency to invisibility of children in public policy, and frankly child blindness amongst the bulk of politicians and policymakers around the world, no names mentioned, that if public servants, and I include myself in my earlier part of my career, lavish the same attention and concern on children in their societies as they do to their own children, we'd be much better off. But there seems to be a kind of a step into blindness where we leave home and turn up at work, and then we forget about kids, even our own sometimes. So that MDG 1 I've mentioned, SDG 1 is a big advance because it does actually mention children in its poverty eradication ambitions, and that's fantastic. I'll come back to that briefly. How many countries have targets explicitly to reduce child poverty? Well, I've searched high and low. Please help me here if you know of others. I'm stuck at UK and New Zealand at this point, and some provinces of Canada. Let me know if you have others. I'm talking about targets explicitly to reduce child poverty as national priorities within poverty reduction. How many nations have mandated public service impact pre-assessments of policy decisions on children? If you build a road, you're mandated to examine the potential impacts for children, both economic benefits and road safety concerns, etc. Truck drivers spreading HIV among kids and so on, sugar daddies and whatnot. I've searched high and low. Please help me if you know any others. The only nation I can find is Wales, that has in the world a mandatory child impact assessment. At least they told me that when I visited the Welsh Assembly 4 years ago. Audits, post-evaluations of non-social sector public investments and policies. The impact of changes in child grants, a retreat from universality, as we discussed in our group. What are the impacts for the poorest and most vulnerable children of changes to child benefits and under social protection? Accountability under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I was involved with the initial ratification of the CRC in Africa, and I think it's fantastic. Again, it's a human species beginning to recognize the meaning of civilization, to have standards, norms, and principles for its own children. and yet we know that the committee, which I think does fantastic work on a tiny budget and minimal resources, doesn't have enforcement mechanisms. It can only cajole and persuade, as is the case, obviously, for the universal periodic reviews in the Human Rights Council and the SDG reporting mechanisms. Is this sufficient for children? Just one other example that concerns me is the debate around universal basic income. Again, I've seen several kind of modeling runs, the Finnish experiment that I was able to engage with a couple of years ago. Children are invisible in the UBI debate. The impacts for children of moving from, a variegated welfare system where you have child grants, pensions, unemployment insurance, health insurance, etc., to one where you wrap it all up in UBI. What are the implications for the most vulnerable people, and the most important people, in my view at least, children? Nobody's really looking at that so far. But if they are, please let me know or put me in touch with them. I think it's really important. So, lastly, it's a bit of a plug, but it's partly a plug on behalf of Young Lives, is when the SDGs were in the final stages of formulation, and I was the SDG lead for UNICEF at the time, we put together a group of child-focused agencies in New York to lobby that children should be visible and explicitly recognized throughout the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets. The indicators came a bit later, and that's been another long story. And at the very last moment, the weekend before, I think the Monday that the SDGs were adopted, we got children into SDG 1. Let me tell you the story. SDG 1 originally sought to reduce poverty among households and the general population. UN Women then intervened and said, this should be for men and women. Actually, women and men, they said, on the weekend before. That gave us, as a group of 6 child-focused agencies, the opportunity to intervene and say, yes, men and women, girls and boys. Why would you include men and women, not girls and boys? So that girls and boys got lumped together as children, but at least that got children into Sustainable Development Goal for poverty reduction. That's a sort of accident. But that group of child-focused agencies grew into this, Global Coalition to End Child Poverty. It's a group of 20 agencies in which Young Lives has played a tremendous role. And I particularly want to recognize Paul's contribution to this. I'm sure he doesn't mind being called out. It's been fantastic at taking initiatives within the work of the coalition. The coalition has a budget of 0 in any currency. It has no secretariat, just has people like me rabbiting on about the importance of children in public policy and like-minded colleagues in the 20 agencies. And again, we've drawn heavily on Young Lives research and insights to try to put the case, yes, an evidence-based case, but one is also making the normative argument, the argument from human rights principles and the ethical case, what constitutes a fair, equitable, socially just and civilized society is one that puts priority to its children, and particularly children who are most likely to be vulnerable and deprived. The link with research, we've tried on our 0 budget, which means essentially that the 20 agencies, according to what they can do, are putting in staff time and little bits of money for activities that they lead on. We held, together with the DFID-funded Impact Initiative based at IDS Sussex, I think the first Pan-African Research Conference on Child Poverty last October. Again, Young Lives was one of the presenters of several pieces of research work there, but a number of researchers in Africa, Africans and non-Africans, and non-Africans working on child poverty in Africa came together. And in my 40 years, I think it's the best conference I've ever attended, not just because I was interested in the subject matter, but because the other 149 people at the conference were obsessively interested, minute by minute, in what was going on. So we are seeking to build on that. It's facilitation, it's stimulation of research, networking of connections between researchers. We found there were lots of researchers in Africa, in African institutions and universities, working on the determinants of child nutrition, very often using the OFI Multiple Poverty Deprivation Index as a kind of a framework for this, using similar conceptual and methodological frameworks to address the same issue. Connect, get some cross-country analysis there, get researchers in touch with each other, not being isolated in their own countries. I mean, there's a strong, for example, research community in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Ethiopia, and so on. But beyond the national boundaries, researchers aren't aware of each other, not talking to each other. That's kind of role that the coalition is attempting to play. And there are 2 spin-off conferences. Next step, closer to policy and practice, will happen in Uganda in September, and another one on equity and social justice in New York in October. So I'll really end with the thought that, for me, I think the most powerful single issue is measurement. That if we get, and I think this has been said before, but I'm looking a bit more now at the economic data. I think we've looked at the data across different dimensions of child well-being, but the economic data are also important. They're part of the picture. I know the OFI MPI doesn't include economic data, which is brilliant. As an economist, I'm happy when economics is put firmly in its place rather than being the dominant discipline and everything measured by GMP per capita rather than child stunting. I have my own views on child stunting. I'm slightly more in favor of it than some of the previous speakers. But the point being that economics is not everything, but it's part of the picture. So the World Bank, for the first time in human history in 2016, for anybody, World Bank, together with UNICEF, issued estimates of extreme poverty among children. To my knowledge, again, the first time in human history that such estimates had been attempted, 385 million children. And most important point possibly is that children on their estimates are twice as likely to be in extreme poverty as adults. Far more likely than the general population to be extremely poor. This is partly because larger households tend to be more extremely poor, but it's also a reality, even if it's a statistical kind of logical outcome. It's a reality. So measurement of poverty among children, it's all its dimensions, including the economic. As part of the coalition, OFI, Oxford Policy Human Development Index, has developed now a child version of the MPI that's going to go into the merger with the Human Development Index that OFI has agreed with UNDP. So we're going to have a headline measure of multidimensional poverty that is disaggregated or both statistically and analytically for children, which I think as well is fantastic. And then the final point is the importance of children's narratives, own narratives and perspectives. I would give equal, similar weight and validity to these quotes that Young Lives has been so brilliant, and the narratives and personal testimonies that very poor children have provided through the initiative. We've tried to do similar in Save the Children. It's not systematic at all. We've heard as well from Plan UK and others as how they've been doing it. This has got to become systematic and scientific, I would suggest, in order that children's voices ring loudly in our own adult brains. I almost said adult brains, as we get older, and that we never lose the music and also the pain as well as the joys of children's own experiences going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So great to be here and to be part of the celebration of the awesome work that has been done by this group over so many years. It's data that I and my colleagues and students have all drawn on over the years, and I've been hearing that from so many people recently. I've been asked to step back a little bit and talk about the issue of how to use different kinds of data and methods to do evidence-based policymaking. I probably am most known for having done a lot of work to promote randomized control trials, but also am now am now back in a policy role as an economist within government, and think a lot about how do we use data and evidence to improve the effectiveness of policies. And So I want to talk about, as I say, how you use different kinds of pieces of evidence in a way to get a whole picture, because a whole picture is what you need to actually change things in the right way. So I, one of the phrases I always use when I talk to people about this topic is, you've got to bring your whole toolbox. When you come to doing evidence-based policy making, you've got to use your whole toolbox. You're not just using one instrument. One instrument is rarely enough to do the kind of work that you need to do. You've got to draw on different types of data and different kinds of methodologies. And I've tried to put this together in a bit of a framework. So I think of this as sort of 3 different types of evidence, or different questions that you're going to answer, and then talk a bit about the different methods that you use to answer those different questions. So the first is about diagnosing the problem. So if you're coming in and you're working with a government who's, wants to address child poverty, the first thing you have to understand is what's the nature of the problem. And that is something that requires a lot of detailed data and analysis locally, right? So we're going to talk about different methods, but also about whether we need to draw on local data or draw on global evidence. So the first step is to diagnose the problem, and that means really understanding the local context. And that means drawing on a lot of different methods, so descriptive data, institutional knowledge, and qualitative data. All of these pieces are going to help you understand what the problem is. The second set of section in our toolbox, if you like, is about general knowledge. So really rigorous studies that kind of really nail causality, as we heard about earlier. And those are useful for understanding, general principles about how humans work. So, because if you've got a causal study that looks at how, whether this caused this, you can help to build up a picture of how humans respond. And humans actually, if you ask at this sufficiently general level, actually humans respond in quite similar ways across quite different contexts. So we're all, for example, we all procrastinate, We all think too much about the short term and not enough about the long term. Now, the challenges and the context in which we procrastinate are very different around the world. But we as human beings all kind of have this commonality in that we procrastinate. So that's another set of questions that use another set of tools. And then finally, when you're designing programs and policy, you need to understand about local implementation capacity. Because it's fine to think, well, this program was very effective over there. When you're bringing it to a new context, you have to think, A, do I have the same problems as they did? Well, if I don't, I shouldn't be bringing it here. But 2, can I implement it here? And that's all about understanding local contextual knowledge. So let me just give you a few examples of of pulling this together. The descriptive data of sort of understanding the context, understanding the problem, which I think, Young Lives has been so amazing at doing, because they look at the problem, from so many different angles, right? Looking at the problem of child poverty from the angle of nutrition, from the angle of education, and getting a holistic picture of what is the problem. That sort of issue, in my context, I've looked at, was focusing on Ebola. I'd done a lot of work in Sierra Leone, and suddenly Ebola hit. I'm not a doctor. I couldn't help them fight the infectious disease, but I knew about data, right? So what did we do? We immediately put our team into place to look at what was happening on the economics on the ground in Sierra Leone. And you heard all these crazy stories about, food prices were going up, people were hungry. And just for someone who knew the context, I was thinking, food prices always go up at this time of year, right? But the journalists were saying, well, food prices are, much higher than they were last month. Yes, that doesn't necessarily mean it's because of Ebola. We were able to draw on the fact that we had a longitudinal study of prices of food in that country, you know, month by month. We reopened that data collection and tracked food prices, and we were able to show that they followed exactly the same pattern as they had in every other year. But you can't do that unless you had that descriptive data. It wasn't causal, it wasn't RCT, it was just describing over a longer term what was happening to an outcome, and it was extremely important and powerful in challenging some of the perceptions. In the second, you know, so I think Young Lives has been really important, and, you know, descriptive data is really important in kind of understanding the problem and focusing on, helping us focus on what the real issue is. You know, the next step of kind of general knowledge of, you know, really understanding causality really carefully is something that RCTs do, but it's not the only method that you can use to get at causality. So, you know, I've seen people use, one of the benefits of a big panel study is you've got all of this data, and then some policy shock happens, and you're beautifully set up to do a difference in difference or use some of these other mechanisms that economists and other rigorous analysts use to kind of understand causality. But as I say, that kind of work is really good at answering a specific question really well, which is very different from kind of understanding the nature of the problem, which needs lots of different elements. So I've talked a bit about kind of how you need to use different kinds of data to answer different questions. The real trick of using evidence to change policy is bringing it all together. Right? Because it's no good when you go in and try and persuade a government that they need to change the policy to just present your one piece and walk away. That's not how policy happens. That's not how change happens. There's two things wrong with that. One, your piece is only ever one part of a much bigger picture. So you may know your RCT, you may know your descriptive evidence, you may know your panel data. But they don't want to only hear about that. They need to see how that fits into a bigger picture of what's going on. And you're much more convincing if you can explain how this piece of evidence fits with everything else. So, you know, we talked about, you know, procrastination, and there's lots of good behavioral work about how people don't invest in preventative health care, and there's good causal studies on that. But that's so much more convincing when you pair that with just basic descriptive evidence of how, you know, people underinvest in preventative health care around the world. So you go in with, you know, being able to explain, you know, and show that you understand the local context, but you can also bring this good knowledge of the international causal data of, you know, what might work elsewhere. So it, you know, what's wrong with just going in and presenting and going away is two things. One, you've got to understand all the evidence around you and what's relevant for them. And second, you can never just present and walk away. Evidence-based policymaking is a partnership. Right? It's a partnership between researchers and evidence providers and the people making the policy. You've got to work together over many years, often, building up the trust, understanding that you're listening, you know, showing that you're listening to them. You understand their problems, you're listening to them. Otherwise, why on earth are they going to trust you to just tell them the answer and walk away? It's just not going to fly. So I guess I leave you with, if you want to get into this business, if you are in this business, if you probably know all of this already, but, you know, if you're doing more of it, we've got to do, yes, rigorous work, yes, longitudinal work, but we've also got to build partnerships of trust on both sides, where we each bring different things to the table, And that's how evidence-based policy works.
I think everybody's quite hot and tired, so I'll try and be brief. I just wanted to really refer to some of the issues that have been brought out already across the whole day, starting with, I think, some of the successes that the MDGs actually did achieve, and I think we've touched on quite a lot of them, but just to remind ourselves that there has been rapid economic growth in all 4 of the Young Lives countries, which has had implications for infrastructure and service expansion. In some cases, the gains have been greatest for the most marginalized children. That's really important. There's been remarkable intergenerational transformation, and we've heard about differences in height, differences in education outcomes, and so on. That's really also very central. There have also been, perhaps more surprisingly, advances between the 2 age cohorts of the Young Lives children. It's only a 7-year difference, but we've already seen that the younger ones are more likely to be in school, and they've generally performed better than the older ones. And growth stunting is down, in particular, in Peru. Fundamentally, we've seen a palpable desire for change in all of our Young Lives families and children. This is perhaps the single, talking about children's voices, the single most important narrative, the question of aspirations for children's futures. Children's futures, but also children are in the position of expectations that they will also lift their families out of poverty. I think the other thing that's worth noting is actually the disparities based on gender are perhaps less pronounced than we might have expected at the beginning of the study. I've been quite surprised by that. In many cases, and in many of the different aspects of children's development, boys have not necessarily fared better than girls, but perhaps even more importantly, poverty has been a bigger driver of disparity than has gender. So I think those are some of the really big picture advances that we've seen. But I just want to refer to 5 challenges, I think, going forward, and gaps, deficits, if you like, for policy. Challenges that I think the SDGs have to take on board. And again, it's picking up on many of the themes that we've heard across the day. First of all, average improvements clearly disguise major sector deficiencies. And I always think here of India in particular, with all the extraordinary growth, economic and otherwise, that we've seen in India. In 2016, only half of Young Lives households actually had sanitation, and over a quarter of the 15-year-olds in our sample were stunted or thin at this point in time. That's a really dramatic finding, I think, for a country like India that's succeeding in so many other ways. I think the other important point around education is that Young Lives children and families have pinned their hopes on education. There's nothing that matters more to them than education. This is the way that they perceive they will leave poverty. But we find educational inequalities are very, very marked across the countries, very different levels of performance between Vietnam, for example, and the other 3 countries, and very low achievement is the norm. It's not the exception. So this isn't just about leaving the minority of children behind. This is the majority of children who experience very low quality education. So I think we need to argue, and very vociferously, for basically the highest priority in education, reducing to 0 the number of children who do not achieve basic skills during their primary school years. And I think it's important that Vietnam is able to do so much more because of the political will and the funding allocation that has been made in that country. So my second major point and the second major challenge is the within-country inequalities, which are so profoundly entrenched. And we've heard about intersecting disadvantages based on rurality, household economic status, minority social status, and other factors. And it's important to highlight that although even in some of these areas, these households may have actually fared better over the course of the 15 years of research than they did at the outset, they remain extraordinarily vulnerable to shocks. And we've looked at a number of ways in which their vulnerability is increased by shocks, from illness to extreme weather events, drought, conflict, and other forms of shock. We've seen the impact of social protection programs, and I was really pleased to see that there was quite a lot of mention across the day of the role of social protection, Juntos, the midday meal scheme, the productive safety net program in Ethiopia. But the age of exposure to these programs matters. It's not just about the design in a more general sense, but it's also about the age. I think it's just really important that we focus on reducing risk and supporting children's development via these child and gender-sensitive social protection programs, but we need a lot more evidence around what really works. In terms of inequalities, I struggle a little bit with the Leave No Child Behind agenda, I have to be honest. I think it's really important, but I've noticed how it coalesces into a series of different ways of thinking that I don't think are necessarily very helpful. So it's very common when we talk about those most disadvantaged that we focus on one area of disadvantage, for example, gender. And actually when it's gender, it's almost automatically girls. And I think our study is pointing much more to the importance of intersectionality and not to just become, in a very simplistic binary way, if you like, just to focus on one aspect, one dimension of disadvantage. There's also a very strong tendency to focus on specific practices. And I was really pleased in Alula's presentation how he unpacked these problems around early child marriage and female genital mutilation, circumcision. It's not just about that practice, it's about understanding the logics, the cultural rationales, and so on that underpin them, and all the context within which it takes place. But I also see a sea change in the way we're all thinking in policy terms. A lot of discussion about norms and values and behavior, and far less discussion, I think, than we need in terms of the systems, the delivery of systems, their effectiveness, their quality, equity, and so on. And I think it's really dangerous to have the one without the other. The third major point, which has come across again and again and again throughout the day, has been early disadvantage casts a very long and a very deep shadow on children's well-being and their development. And this, for sure, makes the case for as a matter of priority, the importance of a strong start. But I think we've also heard a call for consideration of young people thriving is about consolidating and sustaining those early investments. And we need to make a business case for this. I don't think we've done that yet. The business case, James Heckman and others have made a very strong business case for the focus on early childhood. But we really need to think about how do we make the business case for sustained investment across the first 2 decades of life. The third point, interdependence of different domains of children's development. If that's the greatest strength, perhaps, of young lives, we're not a study of health. We're not a study of education. We're a study that looks at the relationship between these different aspects of children's lives. And I think that's really important that we see those interactions and the way they visit down the line in terms of children's outcomes. And I think it's going to be really important to understand what that means in terms of delivery, in terms of the sectoral silos, the power brokering that goes on with some of the ministries that we're working with and so on. Now, does that mean integration or does it mean coordination? For sure, it means we need to do better across different sectors than we're doing currently. And that's about education, it's about health, it's about social protection, it's about child protection. And I think it's all very well to talk about building on the rising school enrollment, and we've had a lot of discussion of this, and how, in particular, adolescents. I think Andy made the point that, yes, schools are important platforms for adolescents, but of course an awful lot of adolescents are not in school, or for them it's a toxic environment. And I get really concerned when we just assume that it is a safe and protective environment. And I would love it if the education community took much more charge of the fact that schools are about safety, they're about respect, they're about hygiene, they're not just about narrow cognitive outcomes and so on. And I think the education community really needs to show leadership in this area, because others are kind of floundering in terms of the advice and recommendations they want to make in this area. My fourth major point is to do with adolescence. We hear a lot now about it being a second window for policy. I'm pretty convinced of that, but I also want to remind us that it's not, as the health community has often led us believe, a time just of risk-taking and of risk behaviors, risks, whether they're sexual, unprotected sexual activity, whether it's substance abuse or whatever it is. It's a time of extraordinary responsibility. And I think actually adolescents often have more responsibilities than adults, because not only are they carrying out the everyday roles and responsibilities, supporting their families, paid work and so on, they're going to school, but they're going to school with the expectation that they will actually be lifting the whole family out of poverty. That's a heck of a lot of expectation to put on young people. And I just think we need to be well aware that they really are struggling and in very challenged environments. They are juggling school, they're juggling it with work and many other responsibilities. There are lots of exciting models and ideas out there. There's the understanding that maybe they're better accessed via digital technologies. There are lots of experiments using mobile phones and so on. But again, I don't want to make automatic assumptions that those digital technologies will somehow resolve adolescents' lives. I think their challenges are enormous, the opportunities are amazing, but we need to be very careful about the modalities and the platforms going forward. And then my final point is Young Lives has focused a great deal, and much of the discussion today has focused on human capital, human development, different ways of framing it in different contexts, with a strong emphasis on poverty and the implications for children's outcomes of different aspects of poverty. But I would just like to remind us that SDG 8 is about decent work and economic growth. Young people really care about getting decent jobs, but the supply for this age group seems to be retreating, and it's increasingly limited. And I just want to leave us with the thought that, it's one thing to think about the demand, it's one thing to think about those aspirations, the way that services have improved children's chances. What about the opportunities? And what are we doing on the supply side? I think that's a really big challenge going forward for the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insightful remarks. So we've heard from Richard about child blindness and raising the profile of children in policy, and Rachel about the importance of mixed methods and in terms of evidence, and also how to do evidence-based policy right, and of course from Jo from that incredible array of important findings from Young Lives. I've been told, threatened with death if I run over 5:20, so you've got all of 10 minutes to wake up and ask your questions, and I'm going to see if I can squeeze in as many as I can in 10 minutes, and so I'm going to take 3 at a time and give them to the panel. So there's one right here.
Great, thanks very much. James O'Donoghue from the DFID, I work for the Education Research Team. And my question is to my colleague Rachel. First is that you talked about evidence-based policymaking being a partnership. It's like music to my ears, and it sounds brilliant. Could you perhaps share a case study of where you've seen that work well in your experience, and then link to that to Jo's third point around the multi-sector nature of child services and sectoral silos making that quite difficult? Perhaps you could each share some reflections, if you have any, on how evidence-based policymaking using the trusted partnerships you spoke about can be applied in that context where it is difficult to find the correct sectoral entry points. Any reflections on that would be welcome. Thank you.
I'm going to take 2 more just in case they're overlapping, so we're going to deal with them all at once. 2 more questions. One here. Thank you.
Less a question, but perhaps a comment. And I think that it's really about the SDGs, and Richard talked about how they were formulated. But still, SDG 1 is a huge opportunity, because it is saying they're going to go for
to reduce by half. And it doesn't actually specify exactly how it's going to be done, and it is hidden away, as Richard said, it's just women and children. However, it's there. So I think the question really is that we have to put a children's face onto the SDGs, and that needs the kind of narrative that we were talking about, both Rachel and Richard talking about. We need to be able to describe what is child poverty in each setting. And I think that's the sort of area of research where so much is needed, because we've got to be in issues like cross-cutting issues like child poverty and gender equality. It isn't. You've got to get attention of the political people and society. You've got to be thinking about it. And that's where the research and the story about child poverty has to be established. And we need a movement behind it. Richard's talked about the coalition, but it's at national level. It's the people who are affected, it's the excluded, and we've got to be able to mobilize those. This SDG is the time, because if we can do it, you can transform children's lives. So I call for something that we've got to get research behind the SDGs, whether we like it or not. It's actually, if people have been in terms of SDG, this is less space than was there for the MDGs and the previous Decade for Children goals. However, it might be the most important one. So I think we've got to change our mindsets as well and get in there, because this could be our last chance, and it could happen. So it's really a core.
Thank you. And just one more at the back there. Thank you.
Hi, Caroline Harper from the Overseas Development Institute. The great and most fascinating thing about Young Lives is looking at this change over time and the context over time and what's happened over the last 15 years. And I wanted to ask this question about evidence-based policy making or policy-based evidence making, because I think we are in really dangerous times, and I think this is a huge challenge for everyone, and I think we'll see in the next 10 years a lot of significant change with the way research is filtered into policy, if it is. And I wanted to ask or get a sense from the countries, what's changed in the countries in this area? How have policymakers engaged with evidence compared to 20 years ago when we started? What have been the significant changes, and what do we have to do to make sure that actually they're interested in this now?
Okay, great, thanks. We've got quite a theme there. So, Rachel, did you want to take the one about a case study where evidence-based policy has worked well? I'm not sure if we'll need them, if people can... The room seems small enough to be okay.
Yeah.
For recording?
Okay. Okay, great. So two quick examples. One is, so I just got back this morning from a conference in Paris where I was hanging out with Rukmini Banerjee, who is CEO of Pratham, which is a big education NGO in India. And we first hung out 11 years ago. Spent many weeks traipsing around rural Uttar Pradesh, doing the kind of assessment of what were the needs, and spending a lot of time in communities, listening to them, and that partnership between researchers and Pratham over many years led to kind of a whole series of evaluations, but that then fed back into policy. And they're changing their programs. But it was really, it's really a partnership. When you sit down with them, it's not that one, that they're the implementer and I'm the researcher. It's we're just the same. We bring whatever we have to the table and we brainstorm. And it's been kind of 11 years of brainstorming. Now, then there's also, with them, partnerships with governments to then bring some of that learning into governments. And they've been part of, the partnership in a sense has widened now. So there's, the researchers in Pratham and then government. So I was also part of building a partnership in Zambia to bring some of their lessons to Zambia. But again, that was a whole discussion about what are your needs, what does the data on the ground suggest are the problems here, and then let's look at a menu of what other people have tried that might match your problems to, you know, what there's evidence from elsewhere. And then we've got to think about how do you implement that locally. So then there was a series of pilots to say, okay, you know, this is your problem, this is what the global evidence says, what can work locally? So, and interestingly, that whole discussion with the Zambian government came from an introduction from another researcher who'd spent, you know, many, many years working with the Zambian government. So we kind of came in as trusted. You know, we built on relationships of others. So, you know, many, many layers of relationship in that final, you know, improvements in learning, we hope, in Zambia came from kind of multi-layered partnerships. I've spoken too long, so I'll leave the other questions to others.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel. So, Jo, you had two related ones, I think. One was also about evidence-based policy and how to apply it, and then I'll put these together. What's changed in how the countries that you've been studying have actually handled evidence in the time you've been running the study?
Yeah, I think actually mine was about the multi-sectoral. I think I'm right. There was a question about multi-sectoral work at the adolescent level. I would love to say that I had a good example of it. I think what's fascinating is that we've understood it and we practice it for early childhood, but we abandon it once children reach middle childhood, and then it becomes all about education. And then when we get to adolescence, well, they don't go to health clinics, so it's all about school again. And then, of course, they're not necessarily in school. So I don't think we've got there. I think it's very much about bringing, maybe it's about social protection and conditionalities around social protection that enhance health and education in adolescence, but it's also about bringing health and education together better. And as I was trying to say, really, we need to be very careful about seeing education as a platform for absolutely everything to do with health. And there are lots of very specific programs that are being introduced into schools which are health related, but they're often very, you know, they're like, it's equivalent to vaccinations and so on. We need to think much more holistically and much more broadly, like what are other referral systems? How do we reach out to, you know, young people who are not accessing school? What other platforms would we want to integrate with that? In terms of the countries, we don't really have the time, but I really feel very disempowered about talking about change in the countries. I'd very much prefer that the country directors, if they can say just one single sentence each about what they think. If that's too big a challenge, let's just have a go, because I really think it's not for me. This is, Santiago, we'll start with you.
You have the officers at the ministries, I guess, in Peru. Ministry of Economics, for example, they are always asking for evidence to support the policies and programs. But then again, somebody powerful in politics comes along and says, this is going to be done, and it is done. So we have the two situations, I guess.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't think we had too much influence during the first two rounds. It's only third round when we could do the inter-cohort comparison, to be honest, that we really could go out there and influence policymakers. I also think, you know, you talked about true partnerships. I mean, just being part of the joint review, I'm giving the education examples, but just being part of the joint review missions, spending 15 days with the government as government nominees, doing a lot of work on national policies and writing some of those bits, which are really outside, you know, I mean, our remit, if you were to say. I think that's what builds the relationship, and that's what, then you get a space on the table. I think just getting a space on the table is important. And it's also, we've been around a long time, I think.
Okay, I think that over the last few years in Vietnam, the evidence-based policy making is increasing, both from the demand side and supply side. On the demand side, I think now the economy becomes increasingly complex. So, you know, there's a try and error approach which worked in the past is that's no longer works. So, now recently, I think the policymakers, for example, they look for new ideas. For example, in the Young Lives project, both the school survey and also household survey, I think we introduced, the project introduced new ideas about 21st century skill. And when Ken made presentation on a kind of problem-solving issue, I think it raised a lot of interest among participants because it's very new. So I think that we can take it forward in the future to bring new ideas, with new evidence on new things. And on the supply side, I think it's really good because in Vietnam we have abundance of data sets, and research capacity increase. So I think that what we observe over the last few years is that demand increases and also supply side. I think the good things are happening. So that's I'm very optimistic.
I'd agree with what Renu was saying, that it's to large extent being there for a long time and creating the partnerships. And as Rachel was saying, it's not a question of just Young Lives evidence, it's when others pick up on our evidence. So in Ethiopia, the Child Research and Practice Forum within the Ministry of Women and Children's Affairs was a wonderful venue for people across, from government, from international organizations, from NGOs, local NGOs, to find a common ground and present research and discuss it in such a way that the government began to take evidence much more seriously. And in 2017, the Ministry of Women proposed a national children's policy, which was approved by Parliament. The Ministry of Youth proposed a youth strategy, and so a kind of a building up of evidence where Young Lives evidence is only one part of a broader coalition to try and bring evidence to the table.
Thank you so much. And Richard, you haven't had a chance to speak. We'll make this the final word, and then we're going to wrap up.
I just wanted to comment on Gordon's call for national movements backed by research to address the SDGs for children in the national context. My comment on this is, I agree. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I want to link that to the idea that we need champions for children. Yes, it's important to hear from children, listen to them, be affected and influenced by children's own views and perspectives and understanding of their own situations, including of extreme poverty. But adults need to speak up for children as well, responsibly, with conscience. And without that, children's voices are always going to be marginalized. So if it's possible to become a prime minister running on a priority platform for eliminating child poverty, as New Zealand has shown, let's see if other politicians are willing to do the same. I hope so.
Okay, fantastic rallying cry to end on. I know you're probably desperate to get drinks, so I'm going to wrap up. So just ending on that call for a movement to end child poverty and champions for children. Just want to thank our speakers, Rachel and Richard and Joe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much to the Child Poverty panel. You covered quite a lot of territory in a short time, and we'll pick up with you again over drinks in just a few minutes. But before we head out to refreshments, can I please hand over for a few closing remarks to Professor Donald Bundy. He's worked for more than 30 years on the role of health and education in the development of children and adolescents. He's spent time as senior advisor in the Gates Foundation. He spent quite a lot of time in the World Bank. He was at Oxford University, Imperial College, University of the West Indies, and now he has landed for the moment. Who knows where he'll go next? But for the moment, he's a professor of epidemiology and development at LSTHM, and he's also a senior advisor to the Children's Investment Fund. Welcome, Donald.
Thank you.
Many of you'll guess it's been a lot longer than 30 years since I started doing this, but I try and, it's my vanity. So really I'm asked to just to wrap up here. So I want to say a big thank you from all of us to Joe and the Young Lives team. This has totally not been your grandfather's meeting or grandmother's meeting, right? This has been an extraordinary meeting, a really stimulating meeting, a meeting that's brought together the topics of education, child protection, nutrition and health, social protection, labour markets and gender, all of those being discussed at a high level, all around one topic. Who deals with topics like that? Sometimes governments do, and I remember times at the World Bank where I would feel really energized by going to a discussion that actually realized lots of things mattered for people. And that when we're talking about human development, when we're talking about the human species, those things all come together holistically in how we talk about achieving human potential. Whether somebody achieves the potential they have depends on all of those factors. It's not just one of them. Whether communities are able to deliver on all of those things will matter. Depends on all of those things together. The World Bank is going to publish later this year a new index on human capital development, which will measure many of these things as part of the way they do it. Whether we agree it's a good thing or a bad thing, one thing we know is that those countries who don't do well on that index will be asking some of you to tell them how to fix that. And one of the tidbits we're already getting is that some countries look like they're doing less than 50% of how well they could do on their human capital development. In other words, that their human resource is massively underutilized. And no surprise, that's occurring in many poor countries, but it's also occurring in many countries that should be doing better and knowing better. So watch the space in October on all of that. Of course, one of the joys of having this kind of mixed meeting is you. It's the incredible mix of people that we've got here. And on behalf of Young Lives, I wanted to thank some of the organizations, particularly singling out UNICEF and SAVE and Plan, that work in that kind of way, work across all of those issues. But also I want to single out some of the donors that take a development-specific line. So DFID, I know, is of course well represented here. Irish Aid, and I'm going to mention the Children's Investment Fund Foundation in the same light. But what I see in this room, and when I look down the list of participants, is an extraordinary strength in depth across many areas across the world, and that's a pretty extraordinary thing to pull together. So thanks again to Young Lives for achieving that. And that we get though that sense as we've been talking today. What is the context in which Young Lives has chosen to hold this meeting? Well, late last year, the Disease Control Priorities Edition 3 was published, and many of you will know that in Volume 8 of that, on child and adolescent health and development, there's a very specific set of statements about the massive importance of the first 1,000 days of life, as has been emphasized, the massive importance, that's absolutely crucial, but then also the huge importance of the next 7,000 days of life. Right? That there's a 20-year period here. Those of us who talk about growing children know that it's 20 years. You don't have a child and then 2 years in you say, okay, that's me done. It's a process. And that's becoming realized by many agencies. And I just wanted to point out, it's not called this, but the Gordon-Brown Commission on Education. It's got another name which is far too complicated. My education colleague perhaps can remember it. But that commission has a very clear statement about the cost, estimating the costs of education, in which it includes the costs of health and nutrition for those children. Right? And it recognizes, and this is brand new, right? This is not the way we've thought in our sectoral silos. It recognizes that you've got to do more than just teach children in order for those children to learn, especially if they're poor children. And then we have the obverse of that. If we look at the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and well-being, which says very specifically, it makes a call for universal secondary education. Universal secondary education as a way of, in part, reaching adolescence. And it makes the point, as was made here, that's not the only way you reach adolescence. Media, health systems, there are lots of other ways. But the fact of a health commission proposing a role for education is, again, a novelty. The Global Partnership for Education recently came to the World Bank, which has published this, the disease control priorities, and asked to republish the volume 8, changing the title from Child and Adolescent Health and Development, which no educator is ever going to read, to Optimizing Education Outcomes. And they've done that. I should say they've done more than that. They've also got lots of new front material that introduces why educators need to care about the health and nutrition and development and the cognitive abilities of children. So we are in a changing world. We are in a world that's changed in important ways. And the theme that came out in this meeting, very importantly, is this life course theme. Several people have pointed that out. The life course. The early part is crucially important. Professor Kumar explained that very clearly. Crucially important. Middle childhood also has its vulnerable periods. We know now that there are probably twice as many deaths in middle childhood as we thought there were, for example. Early adolescence, puberty, massively important period of vulnerability. Important to do things early, but you need to do things in that period as well. And as a recent meeting in Bellagio showed, this is the period when gender disparities start to really emerge as well around then. And then, of course, you have late adolescence, and there's a long list of issues, many of which were picked up by Young Lives in its older cohort. Gender gap widens, mental health issues first emerge, agency strengthens, behaviors become set for life in that period of growing up. That's a hugely vulnerable period. That's a period we need to pay attention to most carefully. And actually I found it's quite one of an anomaly. So this is my personal bit in this winding up. This morning, Professor Durkon made the point that what policymakers need is immediately relevant new information. They don't want, historic information, okay, but what they need is about today, and they need to know, if you make changes now, what's happening. The old cohort that what Young Lives has looked at, now around 20, I think, something like that, and you've got this, as Rachel said, observational data on that kind of group, very important information. But you've also got this second opportunity, which is this inter-cohort comparison, which for me actually is one of the most interesting pieces of the Young Lives work. And you're only up to 15 on your inter-cohort work. Why would we stop at that? That seems to me not the right. One of the saddest things I heard today was that the aspirations of young people, of 12-year-olds, declined to the age of 15. And that was true in all 4 of the countries. Strong external validity, as we find with this evidence. Well, what's happening after that? I want to know. I totally want to know. I think this is the sort of thing that will determine how we can understand the world in which we live in. So I feel there's an opportunity there that needs to be looked at. Final point. We're in a new world. We're in a new world. 2015, the MDGs came to an end, and the SDGs started. We've talked a bit about that. MDGs, that's kind of my generation, very siloed. Education, the youngest group will focus on primary. Health will focus on under 5 mortality. That's the way it was all set up. Actually, enormously successful. SDGs, the new 2030 agenda. Suddenly, everybody wants to do everything. In health, it's universal health care. In education, it's primary and secondary and tertiary education all come into that picture. We have an extraordinary time then that we're in, an extraordinary moment where we are looking in the same way as we've looked at things in this meeting, in that holistic way. Suddenly the silos are looking at the same people. Don't tell them. The health people are actually treating the people who are getting educated, right? That wasn't true with the MDGs, right? That wasn't the same. So we're in exciting times. The world needs people with your expertise, with your breadth, your adaptation and understanding, your range of skills. And I would say the world needs young lives. And I'm sure we all now need to go to the reception. Thank you very much.